Hey team, welcome to Office Hours. I am so excited about tonight's Office Hours, and I know that you all are so excited about tonight's Office Hours. Um, Even that 30-second countdown that we did prior, that we just did, that felt like a long 30 seconds to me because I'm like, I really want to jump into this. So today we are lucky to be joined by Steph Cauffman, who has quite a fan club, just based on all the discussion that has happened prior to this office hours in the Facebook group. But Steph is going to talk to us about using Enneagrams to be the best student you can be, or the best coach you can be, or in other ways, just to understand yourself and kind of have a means of how you approach people and recognizing your weaknesses so you can address them. So I know many people took the Enneagram test prior to this discussion, which will be really helpful. But if you're listening after the fact, or if you're watching right now, but you haven't taken the Enneagram test, that's okay. We will drop the test in the thread so that you can take it afterwards, and then it will all kind of make sense. But first, I would like to start by saying, Seth, thank you so much for being up for this. And I know you've done preparation and you've chatted with us multiple times about it. So we just appreciate you so much and sharing your expertise on this topic.
I'm excited. This is going to be fun.
It's going to be great. And I'm going to keep myself restrained from chatting too much at the beginning because I know we have a lot to cover. So maybe we could start just by, will you share with us a little bit about like your riding background, what your day-to-day is like, and where you're located? Just kind of set the stage for us in your life today.
Yeah. So I grew up in Chester County, Pennsylvania. I I started working to pay off lessons and things when I was 14 because I really loved it. Got my first horse. Um, had probably like one less stop in every phase than would get you eliminated. So had a couple really good horses that taught me to love the sport after that. Um, I worked for a dressage rider for a year because I really wanted to figure some stuff out, and I was getting run away with a lot with my Irish sport horse, who I got when he was 4 and I was 16, and I needed to learn how to have those a little bit better. Then I worked for Missy Ransahausen for about 4.5 years, and then from 2014 to 2019, I worked for Jenny Brand again. That was really cool. I had a lot of really awesome opportunities. Saw a lot, experienced a lot, rode a lot of really lovely horses, and went off on my own at the end of 2019. And I've been building my business here in Ocala, Florida. We have everything from broodmares, baby horses, green beans, off the track thoroughbreds. We've got everything from like my homebreds up to up to advanced horses. I have a bunch of adult amateurs in the barn who are amazing. They work really hard. I am so lucky to have the nicest set of people ever. It's crazy. So my days, it's a little bit of everything because my staff is amazing, so I don't have to worry about too much. But riding, doing a lot of teaching lately, and kind of trying to figure all this out.
That's amazing. And I'm glad you mentioned that you have a great group of adult amateurs at your barn and who you're coaching, because one thing that I picked up on very quickly was that you have incredible people around you. And I think you said it's lucky. I think that there's got to be something to attracting incredible people and like bringing out the goodness in people. So I give you some of that credit too.
Oh, thanks. You can say that, but at the same time, I'm like, no, I think nice people just found me. I'm lucky.
Yeah, it's a mix of both.
It is.
So talk to us about when you were introduced to Enneagrams and why it piqued your interest, and kind of the evolution of you being introduced to it to seeing that it could be a bigger part in your life or your coaching.
So I've obviously been around a lot of top riders and top athletes, and seen and heard some really world-class coaching and world-class lessons. And the thing that I found really interesting is how often people would say, about kind of a famous coach who teaches world-class riders and is great, how many people would go, "Oh, I didn't get anything out of that lesson. I really didn't like it, or it really rocked me," or, whatever it was. And it was interesting. You know, when you're an assistant, it doesn't matter if you teach the very best lesson of your life, you're still B team. So, you know, I was really determined to figure out coaching and how to do it really well. Well, I think it's important when you're coming up and you want to be a professional to spend enough time in a program that you really learn the entirety of the program so that you can kind of decide what works for you, but actually learn it. Like you can't stay for 6 months or a year and think you know what's going on. Um, but you know, it was interesting because I was really determined to do a good job. And I always hope that, you know, the things that I do, I always hope to do it a little bit better as far as like for me, for my students, you know, coming from an emotional place, like, you know, I'm not saying I'm Jenny Brannigan and Philip and Boyd and, you know, all the incredible coaches that I saw, but um, you know, I wanted to kind of figure out a way to do it my way that might be able to kind of take some of that. Well, you know, is I don't know if I just had a bad lesson or I feel stupid or I'm really confused after that. And it was really interesting to see, you know, when I'm at a show, I need a couple minutes to genuinely like, I need to sit there for 5 minutes and have like a minute of silence basically, because I need to tone myself down so far that it's almost like I almost need to be a computer when I go in the ring, especially for show jumping, because I'll get a little bit too busy, too alert, and I need to tone it down. Where like Jenny and Alexa would, you know, they'd be listening to rap music, and like the more they were running, the happier they were, and they'd really want to hype themselves up for it. And so that was fascinating to me. And then also watching, there were a couple of people that I watched over the years that they seemed like they weren't paying attention in their lessons, and they'd almost be switched off. And these were people that really cared, and like they were working hard. Like maybe they were working students, maybe they were people that, you know, put a lot of, you know, when adult amateurs, like they pay for a lesson, like that represents a portion of their life that they've worked. So like they're not showing up and not trying, but seeing these people be super switched off in their lessons made me think that there was something else going on there. And I really wanted to understand that. So I started teaching, and I it's interesting when you go off on your own, kind of realizing that like it's up to you and you need to you don't have a
Yeah.
fallback plan, so you have to figure it out, right? So kind of figuring that part of it out and figuring out what I'd say to different people to get them to respond and be confident. And I started just kind of trying to very intuitively teach people and really pay attention to what I'd say, how they'd respond, how I'd phrase things, how I'd change my teaching style a little bit. Um, and that was going really well. And then Libby Henderson, who I'm sure everybody has interacted with in the
Hi,
comments.
Libby.
Libby, mwah. Libby is everybody's fairy godmother, and she's amazing. She introduced me to Enneagram, and I realized that everybody fairly consistently, I could tell you how I would teach them, like, they'd say, "Oh, I'm a this," and I'd be like, "Oh, I teach you and that person who's also that number exactly the same, and I teach that person and that person who's another number completely differently because that's what they respond to." So, long-winded explanation, but that's how that got down that path, and it's kind of grown from there, and it's been really helpful for everybody, including me as a coach, because it lets me be kinder and more empathetic, but I also think a lot more effective because I don't have wasted communication or communication that makes my students kind of retreat and feel worse about themselves.
Totally. It's so interesting. And like one thing is I just really admire you taking the approach of being so curious about how you can be the best coach you can possibly be and how people are receiving your instruction. It's something that Kinsey and I do with like Ride IQ members and coaches. And the Enneagram thing is so timely in our lives right now. Like we had a call 2 hours ago with a business coach who had us take a personality test and learn about how we work with each other best and like where we would need to fill in voids. And then I mentioned in the Facebook group, we were speaking to the woman who's organizing the Emerging Athletes 21 program through USEA. And she was like, David O'Connor really wants to do a personality test with all the people who are participating
Yeah.
prior. And I'm like, wow, we are hearing this from kind of like every angle right now.
Yeah.
But it's not something I had ever heard before applied to riding, but it makes so much sense because in other areas of our lives, like
Mhm.
if you're a visual learner, you make adjustments so that you can learn best and have the visuals you need. But we haven't evolved, so that's the norm in equestrian sports yet. But I'm
Yeah.
interested. I'm glad that we're bringing this to the audience we are, or that you are, and I'm here for the ride. Before we dive into the specific Enneagram types, I can see there are a lot of people watching. So if you're watching right now, will you, if you've taken the test, put in the chat what your Enneagram type is that you got and include your name, because for some reason we can't always see the people's names um who are typing while we're live on here. So put your Enneagram number in the chat, include your name, and we'll kind of reference that. And as always, put questions as we go. All right, Steph, should we dive into the specific Enneagram types, or do you want to add anything
Let me
prior?
add something really quick. So I had two kind of life-changing things that happened. Well, one was life-changing and one was something that I think about a lot. And so I show jumped with Scott Keach for a couple of years, and he really changed my life in the show jumping. And he used to say something that I think is really true, and that I think people, as a coach, and I think this is something that people need to hear too, as somebody who's, when you're a student, you can't just say, oh, I'm a student, because that's being passive, right? Like, I think it's important to say I'm a learner. So as somebody who's always coming to learn, because as a coach too, and as a rider, I'm still trying to learn a little bit every day. So as a learner, I think it's important to understand this. I think that in reality, there's basically three reasons why somebody didn't execute what you asked them to do. And one is they don't care. And like we went over, like, I don't think that's going to be a thing in equestrian sports, because like if you showed up at the ring on a horse, you care, right? The other one is that you're afraid, and it's really unreasonable to yell at somebody and get angry with them and get frustrated with them because they've got fear. So in reality, and part of Enneagram is understanding kind of what your core fears and motivations are. So it's kind of helpful to understand what place that fear might be coming from, so that you can address it in a way that doesn't spark more fear, right? Like, because I think it's really easy for people to get afraid of being afraid, and that makes it even worse. So um that's something that I think it's really important to think about. Like, if you're scared, that yelling at somebody isn't going to be helpful, and you kind of need to figure out what the right approach is, and that's where this is really helpful. And the other one is that you don't understand, and if you're confused, it's really unreasonable to scream at somebody that, well, just do this, right? And everybody's got a different learning style. So I think as a coach, I think it really behooves a lot of people who teach to learn how to be more effective communicators and find better ways to approach things, and different ways to reach people, because I think there's a lot of situations that would be really improved with just a little bit more clarity and communication, and a more empathetic coaching and learning style. And I think in part of that too, you kind of have to be kind to yourself about like who you are, what your learning style is, and not just kind of go straight to hating yourself, because I think it's really easy to do that. And the other thing that I kind of want to say is, as a coach, and I think people should be really I think people shouldn't be afraid to start asking for this. One of the best things that ever happened to me was I had a lesson where I was getting yelled at to put my leg on and put my leg on, and I'd heard this for years, right? And I was like, I finally stopped and I went, I am squeezing so hard. I think I'm about to do my ACL. Like, my legs are so sore. I cannot physically squeeze this horse one speck harder. Like, what do you mean my leg isn't on? I am in pain. And my coach walked over to me and pulled my thigh away from the saddle and put my ankle against the horse and went, like this. And I was like, and in 10 years, nobody could walk over to me and reposition my leg and go, oh, well, this is the part that's supposed to touch the horse. So I think if you're like, look, I think I'm doing this, I don't understand, or like I'm half holding, there's tons of times where I'll walk over and I'll hold my students' reins and I'll say, okay, I want this half halt to feel like this, or it can feel like this, or in that situation, it can feel like this. So I'll show them, okay, this is what the feeling you're going for is, or this is the part that I want you to touch the horse with. So I think the important thing to remember is that this is a catalyst. Enneagram is a catalyst for change, right? But it's really important to make sure that you're not using this as a passive way to say, well, I am how I am. Use it as a catalyst for self-growth, and don't be afraid to ask for what you need. For me, I needed that visual and the physical help, because I think we get into this really toxic thing where people say you can't learn and feel, and I'm going to say that's complete bullshit. If you take some people, it takes more time, but sometimes you need to be shown what feel you're going for. So use this to be a really active member of your own learning, and don't sit there and go, well, I'm just not good at that, or I can't do this. Figure out how to get what you need and be an active participant in getting what you need. So
I
now
love that. I
we're
love
in.
that. It applies. Yeah. I love that you applied it to both the coach and the student, kind of like taking ownership.
Yeah,
Um, and I like that you described it. As you said, it's an empathetic approach. The word in my mind was compassion, because it's just
yeah,
recognizing that, like, people are well intentioned and good and want to be good, and working together to like bring that out in them is better than them thinking they're an idiot or you thinking they're an idiot. Like, there's a
yeah.
different way.
And a little self-awareness is always really helpful. Like, I know there's some sports psychology to this and things. Like, I'm not a sports psychologist, but I think being able to use kind of like principles about how people learn, but I think really it really is very, I can't understate how much it is important to take ownership of your own learning process and the kind of learning journey, and don't sit there and go, oh, I'm just an adult amateur, I'm just this or that. Because I tell my adult amateurs all the time that I think they really really undervalue themselves, underestimate themselves.
Yeah, it's like taking control of your learning, and also, like you mentioned, there's this opportunity to see where you have not necessarily weaknesses, but like, what is your fear response? Is it to like retreat or be silent? And when you see that in yourself, you can recognize it, share it, whatever, be empowered by it rather than um rather than being a victim of it. So
Exactly.
before we jump into the Enneagrams themselves, I asked people to share in the comments what they are. So when somebody writes something like 6W5, is that six wing five?
It is. Okay, so there's 9 types of Enneagram, and for everybody who's done it, it's a circle, right? And so there's a lot to it. When I kind of go over the different types, remember this is like a brief overview. It's really worthwhile to read more about your types, and especially if you have a wing, what that really means for you, because you might hear this and be like, it's when you get the rest of the story that it's going to make the most sense. But essentially, you've got 9 main types and the 2 ones next to each other. So like I'm a 3 with a 2 wing. I can't be a 3 with a 6 wing because that goes across the circle. But and I'm not gonna have time to get into this, but then there's the parts where, okay, if I'm a 3, and I have to actually check because I didn't write that down because my brain was going to explode. But like if you're a 3 in growth, you might go towards being, whatever other number. And if you're 3 in stress, you might go towards a wholly different number. So that part's interesting. But the thing to remember is that if you're a wing, it slightly changes how you might respond to things. It slightly changes what your responses to things are, and it goes side to side. So you're, a 1 wing 9 or a 1 wing 2. So
Interesting. So wing is kind of like, I'm 3 wing 2 as well. Does that
yes,
mean that you and I kind of were 3s kind of leaning to? Is that a good way to interpret it, or am I oversimplifying it?
that's pretty close actually. So like if we're 3s, right? So we're the kind of neurotic overachievers. But having our 2 wing makes us a little bit more people oriented and a little bit more generous. Where like if we were a 4 wing, we'd be like a little bit more um emotionally genuine maybe, and a little bit more focused on kind of our craft. So the other thing to remember is if you're slightly offended by what Enneagram says, you're probably on the right track, because it does take a little bit of you kind of have to think about it a little bit before you're like, yeah, I hate that, but it's true. It may.
Totally. It's so interesting to see all these people in the comments. I'm going to read some of what people are. So Krista says she's 8 wing 7. Christina Littlejohn is 3 wing 2. Ashley's 6 wing 5. Holly is 3 wing 2, and her horse Archie is an 8.
Amanda Chance and I did our horses the one night, and that was hilarious.
It's amazing. I was cracking up when I saw that starting to show up in the conversation. So Libby Henderson says she's counterphobic 6 with a 5 wing. What does counterphobic mean?
Okay, so this is probably the part where Libby is better at this because I haven't been doing it quite as long, but so actually that might be one that would be best to have Libby explain.
Libby, say something in the chat about what that is. So we have, I'm seeing a lot of 6 wing 5, like Amanda is, Lee is, so we've got a lot, we have a lot of variety, but we're definitely leaning 6 wing 5.
Yeah, which makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
I think I described this to you as they're the ones that remember to bring the flashlight and the batteries and probably spare batteries. They've got the raincoat. They've got all of the stuff. But 5s are people that, and I guess we're jumping the gun, huh? But 5s are the ones that are really into research. So it actually makes perfect sense that people that are drawn to ride IQ anyway would be kind of that personality type.
Interesting. Good for us to know. Okay.
I know, I was thinking like we should target like a certain personality type now, knowing that there's so many of them. Yeah, so I mean, to add to this group, I'm also a 6 wing 2. So the 3 of us are all right.
Is that possible? I don't think that's
no,
possible.
you can't have your second one might be a 2, which means that you kind of have, essentially you have to think of it as like a high.
Oh, sorry, not a 6 wing 2, 3 wing 2.
That makes sense. All right, so we're all 3 wing 2s. That's so funny.
Yeah. Okay, so yes, do we want to start with like going through what 1 is and then go from there?
Yeah, let's do it. Okay, so 1, the nickname is the reformer. They tend to be conscientious and ethical, and they strive to improve. So they're interesting because they have really high standards that they set for themselves. But it's easy for them to be critical and overly perfectionistic. So because they fear being bad, they fear being defective, and they really want to be good and right. And by right, I also mean like morally and ethically right. So they're kind of trying to see all sides. So they really like to improve things and be beyond criticism and really kind of be peak people, right? But while they tend to be careful, they tend to be people of really practical action. So the thing that's been interesting is seeing actually how many people in the military are type 1s, because they want to go and kind of fight for what's right, and they'll fight really hard for what's right. So they're like your Gandhis, your Joan of Arcs, and they're really interesting to teach because they're people that are they're people of instinct and passion, right? But they can be a little bit scared of being wrong and, not, the perfectionist side can get really difficult for them. So when the 2 ones that I have in the barn, they were interesting because they both were really, I say it lovingly, they were a little bit uptight, and they would have a really hard time when it started to go wrong with how to keep their cool and where to go from there. And for both of them, I thought that they were letting perfection get in the way of being good, right? Because sometimes perfection is the enemy of being good. So the thing that I found with 1s, because they are the people that are always striving to improve, and they have this kind of great desire to go out and do it, but they're so self-critical. They're actually the most unique type for me to teach, because I found that the best way to teach a 1 is that instead of kind of doing normal instruction where I'll go, okay, I want you to come around the corner and I want you to shoulder in, and then I want you to circle here, and then I want you to do this, and kind of really laying out the steps. Obviously, if it's a course, I'll give them a course, but if we're jumping. But if I find if I say, all right, I want you to go and I want you to do some serpentines, throw some leg yield in there. And if you run into this kind of problem, I want you to start doing circles. And then I coach them through kind of the adventure that they start to choose. They tend to let go some of the perfectionistic tendencies, because there are people that tend to squash their instincts down a little bit. So it lets their best instincts rise to the surface without them getting really anxious about, well, this doesn't feel right, but I have to do that because she said to do this. So I find that they improve tons faster. If it was hard as a coach in the beginning because I was like, am I doing this wrong? Like, am I teaching these people wrong? Because this is weird. But if it's a bit more of a conversation between us rather than just normal instruction, and then I teach as we go. So that is ones are fun.
Sorry, I have one logistical question before you jump in, Jessa.
Yes.
Out of curiosity, is one on the opposite end of the spectrum on everything versus a 9? Like, are we moving across like a spectrum of, and like,
so ones can actually wing into 9. It makes them more introverted and relaxed, and if they're 2, it makes them more extroverted and empathetic. So no, so 9s are at the top of the circle, and then 1s go here. So you kind of have to think of it as a clock as we go around it.
Got it. And are each one, like, 1s are a little bit close to 2? Is that why there's wings, because you're a little bit close to the one that's next to you?
Yes.
Okay.
That is how I understand it, because like I said, I'm newer to understanding Enneagram. So there's hundreds of books on the topic. So like, this is where, honestly, when we first started talking about doing this, I was like, Libby, do you want to come on and explain
Steph, you are so equipped to help us understand this. Yeah, you are so equipped. One question that I have is, so when you're talking about how you're adjusting your coaching for a specific Enneagram type, did it just take some reflection on your part about knowing what you know about a 1, for example, this is how you'll adjust, or did you kind of like look up how to coach a 1?
So this is actually the part where I was doing this before I kind of just intuitively, before I learned anything about Enneagram and before I'd even heard of it. And then it was like when both of them came back with, oh, I'm a 1. And I was like, oh. So that's kind of been the interesting thing, is it's been something that I've been kind of intuitively sorting out over the last couple of years. And being able to kind of quantify that into, oh, okay, if I know this person's a 1, and everybody's an individual, right? So I make sure that if I have a new person come in, and I don't automatically go like, find out what your Enneagram type is, but it usually comes up at some point because we all really like it. But I kind of feel out the person as an individual, and I take into account what their Enneagram type is. So it's been interesting that way, because it's still kind of collaborative with the individual, instead of just going, oh, you're a this, so you're that. And that's the kind of making sure you're taking control of it. It's not your destiny. It's just something that might help you understand yourself a little bit more deeply, and your learning style, and where you might be coming from with things.
That makes sense. And so we spoke, I hope Amanda doesn't mind me talking about this. But we spoke to Amanda like while you and I and Kinsey were planning this, and she was like, it was so interesting. My first lesson with Steph was like, how do you like to learn? And Amanda was like, I don't know, I've never really thought about that before. And now, having worked with you, I'm sure Amanda could give a whole like description of how she learns, and how she reacts to things, what brings out the best in her, what brings out the worst in her. But it is really interesting to think like that question isn't posed very often. That's kind of like unique to certain people, you being one of them.
Yeah.
But that goes along with what you're saying about a number is helpful, and then also speaking to the person and learning more about them, and just like opening the door for that collaboration or conversation.
Yeah, well, and it's like, and we'll get there, right? But with her as a 5, she needs to know kind of the what's and whys, and understand you can't just say, go do this, all vibes, no facts. Where as a 5, like, she really wants the facts, and then the vibes can come later. Where like as a 4, they really like the vibes just as much, if not more, than the facts. So it's kind of that thing where I think it's almost, you have to feel out the person, and then you take into account, with the Enneagram, you can make sure that you don't essentially misstep, I think is the best way to explain that.
Yeah, I really like that. All right, should we jump into 2s?
Yeah.
Go around the circle?
Yeah, so 2s are the helpers, so they're really people-pleasing, they're warm-hearted, and they're friendly. Their thing is that they're super well-meaning. They're the ones that are always there in your time of need. But when they kind of get into being an unhealthy twos, they can be the really like self-sacrifice to feel wanted person. So because they fear being unwanted. So their biggest desire is to feel loved and needed. So healthy twos are awesome because they see people for who they are. Like they'll be the biggest cheerleader in the barn. They're really compassionate. And I read this thing that said twos show us how to be deeply and richly human, which I thought it was like, oh, that's beautiful. But they have to constantly battle against feeling worthless and unwanted. So I think twos, for the most part, they're pretty balanced to teach. But I think it's easy for them to allow the expectations of others to overwhelm them. And then they get into a bit of a turmoil with themselves because maybe they'll kind of be swept up into, well, this person wants me to go this level because they say I'm talented and my horse is talented. And well, am I wasting my energy and my life? And like, essentially, I think they're quite prone to living somebody else's dream and riding above their comfort, even if it's within their skill. So I think that's something like a bit of a pitfall for them to watch for. And also I find with the twos, it's really easy for them because they are kind of the heart of the barn it's really easy for life and drama to drag them down. So I think kind of being able to come to the barn and sort of shake off the stress of the day and reset and stay focused. So I think just for a two, checking in on their confidence often and making sure that they're really happy with what they're doing and not just trying to please their coach or somebody else in their life.
Man, that feels relatable to me. Everything you just said feels pretty relatable.
Well, and that should feel pretty relatable because if all three of us have a two wing, that'll feel a bit familiar, won't it?
Yeah. And I mean, it's good it's so interesting. I've heard so many people in equestrian sports talk about like either seem a little bit shy about not wanting to compete.
Yeah.
Like almost like
embarrassed.
Yeah, embarrassed. And I'm like, that's the coolest thing ever because you love being around horses and you love what you're doing with your horses, and competing isn't what fills your cup, and that's great. But yeah, there's a little bit of like stress around that and around how that's perceived, I think, for some people. But
totally.
If anyone's thinking that, I think it's really cool to do
I
that.
think it's cool. I mean, honestly, like competing's great, but I'm happiest when I'm just riding around my backfield, riding my horses or teaching, and like watching people have breakthroughs and things is the coolest thing ever to me. So
that's awesome.
Fine.
All right, let's move along to the threes.
Okay, so threes are the achiever. So threes are self-assured, charming, ambitious, confident, and energetic. So we tend to be workaholics and slightly overly competitive. At our best, when we can self-accept, we can be authentic role models. And at our worst, we can suck because they could all suck. So that's the part where when you read it, right, like you'll see things that'll feel insulting because it'll say things like they can slip into, kind of putting on an act to be vain and be kind of whoever they need to be in the moment and things like that. So I think, so speaking as a three right now, I think that that's the part where when you kind of go through and self-understand, the part where it says like threes can kind of have many faces to suit many different situations. You have to kind of reflect on what that really means for your life, because I've come to understand that for my life, that means that even if I'm not having my best day, I can walk into my ring and be the coach that each of my students as an individual needs, because I can put that hat on fairly easily. So I actually find that thing that could be a negative to be really helpful to me. And probably one of my biggest assets for my students, because if somebody needs me to be their biggest cheerleader that day, even if I'm not feeling it, I can put on my cheerleader hat. And so that's the part where when you're reading this, remember that all the things that seem insulting, they're not always upon self-reflection, depending on how you use it. So anyway, so we fear being worthless and bring no value to the table. So we're always striving to basically produce, because we want to feel valuable and worthwhile. Because we want to distinguish ourselves and essentially be admired. But when we're stressed, it's interesting. We can get really disengaged and apathetic. So like, I don't know about you guys, but I'm usually either on or off. Like I'm either moving or I'm like comatose on my couch. So we always are driven to be the best versions of ourselves and find whatever version of success you crave. Yeah. So I think a lot of that is dependent on how you're raised. Like some people, it means that their version of success is a fancy car, and some people it's a lot of money, and some of them it's about being, whatever version of success. It's their ambitions for their education. But we learn to perform and put our best self forward, which means, and this is something I've struggled with a lot, and getting burnt out, because I will find that I'll get a little bit alienated from what I actually wanted, because I'll be chasing success, and it wasn't necessarily what I wanted, but it was what felt successful. And that sucked, and that actually required some pretty serious time off to kind of get that sorted for me in my head. Because we're driven, so we can get really overwhelmed trying to achieve. And I think we can get really affected by the judgment of others. So because of that, we tend to, it's that thing where I said, like, for me, when I'm about to warm up, this one was actually hard for me to kind of write my notes and my coaching notes. Cause as a 3, I had to kind of approach this more from myself, because that was the easiest way for me to, I teach, like, Christina Littlejohn's one of my students. So she's a 3-wing too. And it's a little bit like teaching myself, where I'm constantly saying, you're okay. Like, take that deep breath, take it back a notch, like, and go and show me what you've got, because you've got this. Because I think it's really easy for us to second guess ourselves and kind of freak out and do too much, because I know, like, for myself, that was always my MO. So I think for a 3, you need to find balance between your competitive nature and what you actually want. And always keep your self-confidence and your own personal balance kind of front and center, to not freak out all the time.
This is amazing to me. Like, it's been, for me, I was going to say a lifelong battle, but I haven't been like as self-aware throughout my life. But like growing up, I wanted to do Young Riders so that I could say I did Young Riders, so I could like hang my hat on that.
Yep.
I chose a college that I thought other people would think was like most impressive, and it was like the worst fit ever for me. I went on to a career that I thought was like the one people would be proud of. I was awful at it. And it's like, now after a number of times this happening, I'm like, I need to reflect on like who I am and what I want. And now the way it's showing up in my life is I'm planning a wedding, which, like, very passively, because Red IQ is, takes some time, but planning a wedding, and I keep being like, why am I doing this? Like, what do I really want? I don't think it's really I don't think it's the path that I keep getting pulled down, kind of. So, checking in why you do things is really interesting. So I know you said Christina's one of your students. I saw Holly's also 3-wing too. So Christina, I'm sure this is all very familiar to you, but Holly, I don't know if it was familiar to you, but in the chat, tell us if this is resonating with you too. All right, let's move on to 4s.
My 4s. I have so many 4s in my life.
Really? I see Amanda's 5-wing 4.
Yes, but the best part is all my people that are 4-wing something else or just a 4. I got multiple texts today going, hey, be nice to us 4s, because without us and our existential crisis, there would be no, authors and artists and things. And I was like, don't worry. I got you, boo. I know you're emotional.
Oh my God, that's cute. I can't wait to hear what a 4 is.
The 4s are really self-aware. They're sensitive, they're creative, and they're really emotionally honest with themselves. But they can be a bit moody and self-conscious and slip into emotional distance and a little bit of self-pity, which makes them interesting to coach, because they know themselves really well, but sometimes it's hard to keep them from the land of the existential crisis, because they fear lacking identity and personal significance. And they desire to figure out kind of themselves and their own significance in the world and create their best identity for themselves. they're interesting because they're the ones that create beautiful spaces and moods. So they are like authors and artists. And one of my students who's a 4, she's a therapist, and kind of like she posts things about like a therapy garden and things. So they're the people that kind of curate spaces that make you feel a certain way. They tend to see themselves as being fundamentally different than most people, and maybe a little bit feel often misunderstood, which makes sense when you figure that they relate to themselves in a way that is a little bit different than the way most types relate to themselves. And they're really aware of their inner self. So my 4s, they tend to roll with vibes first. Like they want to know how it's supposed to feel, and they want to know kind of the general mood of what they're going for in their lessons. They are people that they need a little bit more direction to keep them out of a little bit of an existential crisis. Like if they make mistakes, they'll like beat themselves up really, really hard. So they need a minute to process their feelings, and they need acknowledgement. You can't just say, no, stop it. That like, don't do that, because that is the core of their person. So you have to acknowledge it without feeding the drama and say, okay, I see you, but we're going to keep going because you've got this and you're going to be okay. They're really intuitive people, and you kind of have to make sure that they don't get unduly down on themselves and insecure. They need, I think of all the types, I think the 4s and 6s probably need some of the most positive coaching because it keeps them focused on the right path.
Wow, I'm just getting caught up in these comments. There's so much activity. People are really appreciating this, but it doesn't surprise me at all, because sometimes it's like a little bit like relieving to like know like you're not crazy, and like you fall, like it almost feels good to like fall into a bucket and be like, okay, I get it. Like I'm not alone. I'm not the only one who is like this.
Yeah.
So, and it also like feels freeing to be like, okay, I know this about myself. Here are like the things I can do with it.
Yeah.
I don't know. I love this. But Holly said, as far as being a 3 wing 2, she said it resonates so much, except interestingly, I don't get upset about not looking good in riding. Like I get eliminated, whatever, versus at work, personal, I care way more. But yeah. I realize my fear motivation in riding as a 3 is never wanting to look like a bad sport, ungrateful, disappointed. That's really interesting to me, because I think I would probably feel the same way. Like,
yeah, I really feel that too. And I think the thing you have to remember too is that there's kind of the healthy and unhealthy versions of each one of the types, right? So like if you read through kind of all the different levels of what they are, like the top one, they're essentially like, you are Gandhi and you are like a leader and a motivator and all of these things. And then when you go all the way down to the like lowest type, they're like, you may be a serial killer. So like there's all kind of flavor of different things, and how, where you are in your own mental health will impact, the things that are important to you, and like the parts that you want to control, and how the different things manifest. And that's the part where I said, like, it is kind of the individual part of that too.
Got it. And can a 3, this might be a dumb question, but can a 3 wing 4 because it's next to it, or can you not wing up?
You can wing up or down. Yeah. Okay. So 3 wing 4 would be probably a little bit more emotionally genuine, maybe a bit more emotionally honest with themselves is what I'm trying to say, and maybe a little bit more focused. Because I know, personally speaking, as a 3, I think we tend to be a little bit scattered, trying to do everything and be everything. And like, I think we're kind of the quintessential yes men, because we try really hard to, like, I know for myself, I spent a lot of years saying, well, with the right application of effort and time and, whatever else, I can make pretty much any miracle happen. Probably at the cost of my own mental health and sanity. But yeah, I think it makes it easier once you understand like that kind of stuff is not necessarily healthy. You don't always have to be the yes man, because as a 3, right, you're like, well, this looks good and I could do it, so I should. Sometimes you shouldn't.
Yeah. I generally find myself like assuming that I could fit more than 60 minutes in an hour. And it's like, that's not how it works.
Well, I am always running like 10 minutes behind because I'm like, well, I've got 5 minutes. I can do at least things. And then I'm like, oh, shit.
Yeah, totally. I can walk the dog, make food, read a book
Overly
at the same time.
Oh, yeah. Overly optimistic.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got our 4s. They are our sensitive friends, and then we've got our 5s. What are our 5s?
So 5s are the intense and cerebral types. They're really perceptive and innovative, and they're really curious about the world. So they develop complex ideas and skills, but they can be a bit detached from social situations, and a bit high strung because they live really rich. So where 4s live really rich emotional lives that they're connected to, 5s live really rich lives in their heads. So they can be really intense with themselves and where they are in their own headspace. When they're stressed, they seek isolation, and they can be a bit nihilistic, which is always entertaining, because they fear being useless, helpless, and incapable, and they really want to be capable, and they want to be competent. So my mom's a 5, Amanda Chance is a 5, and they're people that you, as a coach, they seek a lot of depth of knowledge because they really want and need to know the what and why of how things are done. So there's 2 parts of that. You have to explain it to them, but you can't. At some point, you have to say, you have to make sure that they can stop explaining it back to themselves and make sure that they're not switching off the feeling part of their writing, because they almost will use too many words, and kind of be trying to slot it too much into the file folder of their explanations. So what I find with 5s is they really need time to process information. They need to be told to keep the feeling part of their writing on. Don't overthink it, or like, we'll think about it in a second when we stop, but keep writing it, keep feeling, have some confidence in it. Because a lot of times I think they start feeling like they don't do things as well as other people, but mostly that's because they're lacking some clear explanation and some clear direction, and they are in unknown territory, which they are fascinated by, but they kind of fear. So what I find is that 5s get overwhelmed when their existing idea of the world gets interrupted. So you have to relate new concepts to things they know. And like I said, they tend to internally overanalyze. So you have to kind of make sure you give them the right time to process with the right explanation. And then you have to say, all right, you're good. You've got this. Give it a go, because you're going to surprise yourself. And they generally do surprise themselves as long as they have it presented in a way that makes sense to them, because it really sucks to be somebody learning and go, well, I think I'm stupid because of XYZ, and I just don't understand things. And then to kind of realize that, no, you do, you just needed it to be explained to you in a way that made sense to you as a person. So they need to know the theory and not just the mechanics of something, essentially.
I have a quick question, and maybe it's not that relevant, but I understand that the Enneagrams exist on a circle. Is there any sort of like opposite effects of that circle? Like if you're kind of like a color wheel, you're the opposite of the color across from you, or is that not really relevant for this?
That's not so much relevant, but there is a thing where like certain types, like a 5 might go, and I'd have to look this up because I don't have this in my head. This would be a good Libby question too, but like I think 5s go to 8 when they're stressed, maybe, and then they go. So what they essentially say is that when a type is stressed, you might go to this number in stress and that number in a growth moment. So it's not really so much opposite as you might kind of branch out into and take on some other pieces of other types, depending on where you are in your mental health and in your life.
Interesting. Amanda just commented. She said 5s go to 7 in stress and 8s in growth.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That's a really interesting way to like also think about. I know the wheels. The wheel is how I think about it in my head. I know it's not necessarily a wheel, but the Enneagram circle.
Yes, totally. Well, and that's why it's like it doesn't kind of like I said, it's for that one, it's 7s, 8s. And I think for the 3s, it's a little bit more, a little bit further apart. So it depends on the type.
And because there's so much that you can dig into, I also want to mention that in the comments, I just put a list of resources that Libby put together for everyone that was so legendary for her to do.
Yes.
But she put together websites, podcasts, books that are all great resources for anyone who wants to learn more. So we'll put that in the episode description in the app as well. But I just wanted to mention that because I'm sure people are going to do some digging after this too.
Yeah.
And thank you, Libby.
Libby's the best.
Libby added in the comments, she said, when you look at the Enneagram circle, you will see arrows between some numbers, and it will show you where each number goes to in stress and in growth. The symbol will tell you 3s go to 9 in stress and 6 in growth. Very interesting. Yeah. So there's a lot to learn here, a lot to learn about yourself. Okay, so we're coming up here on the hour, so I want to get to 6s, 7s, 8s, and 9s.
Yes. Okay. I'm going to go through this fast. All right. 6s, because especially since we have so many 6s, they tend to be really committed and security oriented, reliable, and trustworthy people. They're fabulous troubleshooters and problem solvers, and they really foster cooperation and community. They fear being without support and guidance. But I find that 6s can get really, especially like for Libby, because I think this is the counterphobic part, is I think they feel a lot of times like they don't necessarily have the support within themselves, or they don't have the capacity to problem solve without the support of others in their community. So they're really self-aware, and they create big internal bulwarks against stress, but sometimes they need to kind of let the wall down and kind of embrace the stress so that they can go a little bit more towards growth and realize that they do have the capacity to succeed, but they need really clear steps, and they need a lot of empowerment to show them their capacity to succeed. And they also need space and time to work through their issues without kind of external pressure that's either really pushing them or like making them feel like they're getting in somebody else's way. Sorry, brief version. I'm trying to get through these fast now.
No, I love that. That's super helpful. Yeah, there's a lot of those in the chat. I don't know whose names they were anymore, but
right, because like they're the people that like, it makes sense that those are the people that would be most attracted to Right IQ, because they're trying to find more empowerment and support, and kind of create that within themselves. So it makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah, I love that. I love them. Okay, so 7s.
Okay, 7s. So I have not yet found an equestrian 7. So I'm going to go through this quickly because they're spontaneous and playful. So from what I understand, because like I said, I have not encountered one in the wild yet, they're the big idea people. So they're the CEO that goes, okay, I've got this idea and this list, and they're constantly chasing the high of kind of creation and all of that. So I'm assuming we don't see a lot of them in eventing and other sport horse sort of activities, because they're probably not super excited about perfecting their 20-meter circle. But I would assume that they're the type of people that could pick up a new skill easily, but they probably need really precise goals to stay focused, or they get bored, discouraged. So I think they're probably people that they maybe would lose track easily of how to get where they're going. So they need a little bit more guidance to keep them on the straight and narrow. But we have never found one yet, which is
we need to find one. If you're a 7, raise your hand, come forward. We want to talk to you.
Tell us what you think of dressage.
Yeah. We gotta find her or him, whoever it is. We're waiting for you. That's my one goal from this, is that we find a 7. Okay, so 8s.
8s are funny. Okay, so 8s are powerful, dominating, self-sufficient, and willful people, and they're very assertive. And they really like to control their environment, and they struggle with vulnerability and tempers sometimes. But they're at their best, they're self-mastering and use their strength to improve other people's lives they can be really like heroic, magnanimous, and inspiring. At their worst, they're terrifying, you guys. They fear being harmed and controlled by others. And they desire to protect themselves and be in control of their destiny. So they have a lot of willpower. They really like taking on challenges. But they can shut that down and get really rock-like to protect themselves emotionally. At their best, they have a lot of common sense and ability to withstand adversity. So they probably are people that really are very successful. Like, I think a lot of top riders are probably 8s, because it's a type of personality that will let you keep going through the biggest adversity you could think of. I find they need a lot of communication to maintain common ground, and they really like having a goal to strive towards, but they need the communication, and they need to feel heard. So here's the important thing. If you're an 8, communication has to stay really honest, because if you start doing the thing where you shut down to protect yourself internally, and you start not being genuine either to yourself or to your coach, that's when the communication gets really funny. So make sure that you're always coming from a really genuine place. And I think for an 8, it's important to assume that the other person is coming from a really genuine place as well, to keep it in an open and honest and spot that isn't going to make you feel like things have gotten a little bit crappier than it needs to be.
That's good advice and actionable advice.
Yeah. Well, some of my best friends are 8s. I've also had some really bad experiences with 8s. So, that's where I say, and they're people that, they're not afraid to say it how they feel it, but that's where it's really important to kind of keep really honest and open communication that is kind of without too much ego on either side.
Yeah. It's so interesting that you said that a lot of top riders are 8s, because it jogged my memory that about 2 years ago, I was sitting on a panel with 3 other women.
Yeah.
We arrived and they were chatting about Enneagrams when we got there. And they're like, "What Enneagram are you?" I didn't know. And they were all 7s. And then
Yeah.
I got home, took the test. This is like a memory that apparently was very deep, but because it just jogged right now. But I remember taking the test and being like, kind of like, darn, I'm not a 7, because these badass women that were on that panel, they were all 7s, and it felt like a factor of landing in that spot. But it's interesting that like success in certain areas or certain endeavors likely have something that's kind of similar in this realm.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. Do we have time to go through the 9s?
Oh, of course. I mean, as long as you're willing to, we're willing to.
No,
sure.
We can keep going until everybody's sick of it. Okay, so 9s are they're the peacemakers. So they are accepting, trusting, creative, and supportive people, but maybe they're a little bit too willing to kind of squish down their own wants and desires to keep the peace, both internally and externally. They really fear loss and separation, and desire peace of mind and stability at the and probably at the cost of all else if they're in a wrong spot. So 9s are interesting, because my understanding is that they can embody the whole Enneagram. So they can have the strength of the 8s, the fun and adventure of the 7s, the dutifulness of the 6, the intellectualism of the 5s, the creativity of the 4s, it says the attractiveness of the 3s, but I think that what that really means is the 3's ability to, the ability to put on all the different hats, the generosity of a 2, and the idealism of a 1. But they don't necessarily have a strong sense of ownership of themselves. So they're the people that can tend to numb out a little bit to avoid conflict. But they're people that can see a silver lining in every cloud, because again, they're really trying to avoid conflict. I find 9s to be a ton of fun to teach, because they tend to be really happy and delightful people. But 9s are people that you have to check in with a lot and make sure you have a really trusting relationship with them, because they're the people that if you have bit of a problem in the training, if they're worried about something, if they're feeling something, they might be really, really hesitant to say something for fear of disappointing you. So I think it's you need to make sure that they have a safe way to feel like they can communicate their actual wants, desires, and concerns so that it can be collaborative problem solving, and they don't think that you're going to hate them for saying either like, hey, I don't know if I want to move up at that show, or that thing that we tried, it feels really crappy, or like whatever it is. They need that really safe communication. Even more like where the 8s, it needs to be the open and honest communication. They need safe communication.
I love that. I'm just like, my heart is warmed hearing about all of this because it's about how we can connect with humans in like positive ways. Cool. Well, how would you like to tie this in a bow? I do have a final question for you, but it's not so related. So how would you like to tie this part in a bow?
Whatever you think.
I think if anybody has, I mean, this, I keep taking credit for I personally armed you all with the knowledge you need to be your best selves. But I think that this is just like really opens people's minds to learning more about it and using it in ways that can be helpful. I learned a lot, and I'm definitely going to dive into, I'm a podcast listener, so I'm going to dive into the podcast that Libby sent along, but whatever way you like to learn, there's something there for you. So check out that list as well.
Because we found that there's a lot of podcasts by 5s about 5s, and I think that has to be the most 5 thing ever, to be like, let's do a deep dive on being a 5. That's as like not at all a 5. I'm like, is he flailing around doing shit? I don't know, guys.
Yeah, that's so funny. Well, I love this, and I'm gonna start. I think it's interesting because I'm sure when you meet people, you're like, probably a 1 or probably a 3 or whatever it is. And I'm excited to start. I mean, it's totally like a psychology perspective to kind of like understanding people a little bit better. So, yes, I think this is all great. If people have questions, put them in the chat. I know Steph is now in our Facebook group, and everyone else who's interested in this is there too. So feel free to continue the chat in the chat. Steph, to take us kind of a step away from Enneagrams, I would like to end with the question of, what is the part of your job that brings you the most joy or fulfillment?
I just feel really lucky that my day, like I have a 2-year-old daughter, so I get to start my day with her. She comes to the barn with me. The girls that work for me are amazing. I've got a barn full of nicer horses than I could have ever had, like ever dreamed about. Like I grew up in the suburbs, right? Like I made my dogs jump. I used to put tomato stakes with bamboo poles up and make my dogs jump them because like I really wanted to ride. So
we can relate.
Yeah. So just being able to show up every day and have a barn full of horses that are nicer than I could have ever dreamed of, with the nicest people that I could ever hope to work with, that are so genuine and let me really kind of explore how to be a better person myself, and figure out how to do the best I can do. And I feel like it makes me a better person every day to help everybody achieve their goals, and kind of try to make this crazy ride the most kind of genuine and human one that's possible. And just kind of getting to realize that there's a way to do this. Everybody's got a different way to do this, and you can do it on your own terms, and it feels really good.
Well, it's so clear how true that is to you. Like the very first interactions we've had, through the interactions and this conversation, it's just like through and through so clear that that's what you're all about, and it's amazing. And I am very convinced that it is just no coincidence that you have amazing people around you, because I think you bring out the best in people. And I'm glad you mentioned your daughter too, because you guys, Steph has the world's cutest daughter. It's unbelievable. Today's Paige. Steph, what Enneagram do you think Paige is?
Man, I've been trying to figure that out. And I think she would tell you she is all of them. She embodies the world.
She's hard to pin down. I
She
like
is
it.
hard to pin down. Well, it's funny, right? Because for ages, and I've learned more about all the types, like doing my research and taking notes and making sure that I was going to be able to present this in a way that made any kind of sense. And I didn't just get here and be like, beep boop. And it's interesting because I thought for ages that that my other half, Donnie, her dad was a 4, and now I'm like, but there's parts of him that really, he might be an 8, and kind of realizing that just because somebody embodies one thing, it doesn't mean they're not also something else. And I think that the thing too that's really helpful that I should actually throw out there too is, we joke, Amanda Chance and Libby and I always joke that, like, as a 5, Amanda loves to do a good old Irish goodbye and just nope on out of there. Where I think you guys can kind of understand that, like, emotionally as a 3, and actually Libby said 2 as a 6, like that feels a bit like a gut punch until you understand that, because you're like, oh my, did I do something wrong? Like, did I hurt my friend? Like, is something? And then you start to understand that, no, maybe that person is just peopled out for the day. They're full up emotionally. They just can't even anymore. And that's okay. So I think it lets us be a little bit more empathetic to somebody else's needs, and also maybe be a little bit more, I don't know if the right word is be a little bit less self-centered about their needs are their own. And my needs and my part of this is probably not actually as relevant as I'm trying to make it sound. So like, it's a little hard on the ego sometimes, but it kind of makes you understand that people's own private emotional lives are probably a bit more theirs than it is your problem. I read this thing one time that we as humans can only really understand. It's that whole thing where, like, one person's death is a tragedy, but 100 people's deaths are like 5,000 people's deaths. It's like a little bit more of a artifact to us. So we can only really think of a certain number of human beings as a human being and understand them, because that's just how our brains work. So I think it helps keep kind of the human element and everybody's motivations a little bit more understandable when you realize that, yes, we might go, that is outside of the amount of people I can concentrate on, but they've got their own stuff going on. And it's not my problem. Like, I can help them, but, like, it's not my burden to bear. So it is my problem in that I want to be the best person to them I can be, but it's not always your burden to bear.
Totally. It's freeing. Like, it makes it makes it easier to understand, or just to be like, that's what works for them. I don't have to interpret this through
Myself.
my whole world. Yeah, just like let it be.
Yeah. It takes a little bit more ego out of it, which again can be a little bit emotionally rough, can it? But I think it's really helpful to be able to view the world through a slightly different lens that way, and be a little bit more understanding of where other people are coming from, and just on a human level, right? And it kind of, I think it makes you stop and think a little bit more before you react, or at least it does for me.
Totally. And I mean, there's a lot of research that backs up the fact that the happiest people are the most compassionate, and this is a step towards being compassionate and towards seeing people in a light that they're a human doing their best too. And like, how do we understand that a little more? So well, this was such a treat. I could and want to talk to you all night.
So fun. Hey, at least we won though. We didn't start talking about fluffy baby cows.
I was so tempted when you were talking about your day-to-day life. I was going to be like, and the goats and the cows.
Oh, okay. So I think this is something that you guys will appreciate as fellow 3s. So there is something about me that makes me do this thing where my life started to feel like semi under control this summer. And I was like, no, we can't be having this. So I randomly showed up at the barn one morning with 3 baby goats. because my life needed more chaos.
I love that. And I think that is how decisions should be made and life should progress. So you still have the 3 goats, right?
Oh yeah, they're Paige's goats. They cleaned out the weeds in the middle of my walker. They are, because I dove in with all vibes, no facts, I didn't realize that if they're not bottle fed, they're feral. So I went to, so I'm in Ocala, so we're like an hour from the villages. So I went to the villages, and I say this lovingly, but two hippies my age with butterfly nets, caught these goats in butterfly nets. They were exactly what you're expecting them to look like when I say they're hippies from Florida who have goats and pigs and did not wear shoes. And I loved them. They were the most delightful people. But then the goats were feral, so we've been taming them. So my dressage coach who stays at the barn, I've been riding with her since I was 15. She's the one I worked for a year. She's going to be down here in 2 weeks, and she slightly disapproves of the amount of chaos that we all appreciate at the barn. So I think I'm going to wait to let them out until after she goes back home. But you know, we have kind of we laugh all the time at the barn, and we're like, no, there's no fun allowed. We can't have fun, because I refuse to take life so seriously that I make myself miserable. So we try to kind of keep it really lighthearted and really fun. And it's amazing how much success we've all found in our riding and joy in our personal lives and joy in the horses, because we aren't as focused on performing. And I know that doesn't work for everybody, and that doesn't necessarily resonate with everybody, but I mean, we are out there just enjoying ourselves, and it's amazing how well that's worked for so far. So far, so good, you guys.
Well, that's the perfect note to end on. And I think that there's something to it, like finding the joy in the journey. That's, it's not the first time we've heard it. And I think that it's important. So if anybody's interested in like dipping their toe into those waters, I think it's a good idea. All right. Well,
you can't make yourself miserable just because you feel like you should be doing something. It doesn't last. You can't sustain that for long. I've tried. It doesn't work.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you are on I'm glad that you are where you are with the people that you are and the goats that you are and the daughter you are and even the dressage trainer you have, because it sounds like the whole dynamic is like good.
Oh my God. One of my students, she's got an older retired horse at the barn, and we just open the door and he walks out to the riding field and he'll just graze out there loose for like 8 hours while we're doing our gallops. He's like, hey guys. She'll be teaching a lesson and she'll be like, what is going on?
Seriously.
He's like, what is happening? And we're like, it's just Cruz. He's living his best life. And she's like, what the fuck? So
yeah, he's definitely living his best life. He's watching you guys gallop by. The horses you guys are on are probably like, how do I get that job?
Yes, but everybody else is a chaos machine. Nobody else gets to do that.
Yeah. Well, Steph, you have brought just a lot of joy to my evening, and I'm so glad to know you and to have your phone number, because the text will continue.
Please do.
Even though office hours is over, I can't stop having pictures of Paige or pictures of mini cows or goats or anything like that, because I've gotten used to it now. So we're so happy to know you and so happy to like know more about this topic. So thank you again for taking the time and teaching us more about it.
That was so fun. Thank you guys. I really appreciate it.
And thank you to everyone for participating. This was awesome. Definitely hit the record for our most engaged chat during an office hours, which is something. All right. Well, I hope everyone has